Hey guys, today we're going to talk about broken promises and the Native Americans' fight to survive in the West. After European and white Americans started moving westward because of things like the Transcontinental Railroad, you're starting to once again see the two worlds of the Native Americans and the white Americans collide. And we're going to start to see a real decrease in the quality of life for Native Americans during this time period. We've done a lot in class already to talk about this. We've seen America, the Story of Us, and some of the things that they talk about as far as the disappearance of the buffalo. You've played Mission US, or at least you've played part of Mission US, and you've had an understanding of what it was like to be a Cheyenne boy during the time period of westward expansion. You should have a pretty good understanding of some of these things that went on. But today we're going to talk about more specific pieces of legislation and battles that really changed the way Native Americans will live forever. So the first thing, in the 1830s is really when the government relocation of Native Americans first started. We see, got to fix now. In the 1830s, we see the Indian Removal Act being signed, and it was signed by President Andrew Jackson. And this is the law that was responsible for the Trail of Tears, right? Where they took the 5 civilized tribes of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminoles, and they moved them from the southeastern part of the United States here all the way to Oklahoma, which was called the Indian Territory. The idea was it was going to be one great big reservation. That was all great for a while because people thought the Great Plains and this land in the middle of the country was not good for farming until more and more people started to travel west for things like the gold rush because of the Oregon Trail. And as they start passing through this on their horses and in their wagons, they start to realize, wow, these Great Plains might actually be good farmland. We might be able to use this someday. Excuse me. So they started to pressure the federal government to relocate the Native Americans once again. Except for they didn't only want to relocate the Native Americans that were living in Oklahoma. They wanted to relocate all Plains Native Americans so it could be opened up for settlement. So that's what they did. In 1851, the government met with a number of leaders from the Plains Indian tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne and Arapaho. They met in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, which is actually a fort right along the Oregon Trail. And they signed a treaty. Most of the tribes didn't want to sign this, but they saw no other choice. They figured if they didn't sign it, they may lose all their land and have absolutely nothing. Basically, what the treaty did is it was an agreement between the whites and the natives saying that the natives would allow people traveling on the Oregon Trail and other trails west to pass through their land. In return, the Native Americans got $50,000 a year for the next 50 years. So it was a lot, but many Native Americans didn't want to give this up, and they didn't want their land to be set in boundaries, right? Before, they thought they had all the land. They thought that was theirs. But now you're starting to see more of these boundaries, and their boundaries are being restricted to smaller and smaller spaces. Some, however, resisted and chose to fight, right? Some did not want to sign this treaty, and so they chose to fight. And we'll see how that worked out for some of these different groups in a little bit. Around this time was the Sand Creek Massacre. Some of them that resisted and either chose to fight or chose not to move would just peacefully live on in their land. And one of these tribes was a Cheyenne tribe. And in 1864, Colorado militia came and they opened fire on a peaceful Cheyenne village. And basically because they didn't leave. They refused to move they refused to allow the white settlers to travel through their land. What ended up happening is 200 men, women, and children died. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Lakota responded with raids on soldiers and settlers. Right? They said, hey, if you're going to do this to us, if you're going to massacre our people at places like Sand Creek, we're going to start to raid you. Some of you may have seen this. Little Fox, I believe, had the opportunity to do this in Mission US. Depending on who you are will depend on if you actually did this. But they did that to get back. They did that as a way to say they weren't going to sit down and take this. And it created a lot of violence. In response to that violence, in an effort to stop it, the federal government created a new reservation for Native Americans. And this was done through the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, in 1868. And basically what it said is, okay, the Native American tribes now are going to be moved another time to the Black Hills region of South Dakota, which is in like the southwest region. This is where Mount Rushmore kind of is. And this would be their new land. The white Americans won't touch it. This is for the Native Americans. That was all fine and dandy until some white prospectors, miners, found gold in the Black Hills. And you can assume what's going to happen once more and more people find out that there's gold there. That's right. More and more people are going to storm into the Black Hills. They're going to take over the land that was given to the Plains Indians people. Some of these people kind of took it, but others decided, no, we're going to fight back. We're going to push back. We're not going to allow this to happen. So, led by two Sioux chiefs, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, these guys fought back. They said, we're not going to let this happen. We're not going to let you come onto our land. We're sick of this. We're done moving. This is ours. Stay off of it. So we start to see some of those types of violent conflicts arise between the whites and the natives again. The Treaty of Fort Laramie remains a source of contention. Actually, just about 30 years ago, in 1980, there was a Supreme Court case called the United States Government versus the Sioux Nation of Indians, and it actually ruled in favor of the Sioux, and it granted them over $100 million for the land that was stolen from them. But the Sioux said, no, we're not going to take that money, because if we take that money, we're giving up claim of ownership to this land, and it's no longer ours. So it actually turned down $100 million so that they could still make the claim that this was their land, because that's what they truly believe. You're starting to see a lot of these things continue, these violent conflicts. And in the 1870s, we start to see the Cheyenne fight back. Not just the Sioux, but the Cheyenne as well. Excuse me. And we see a guy named Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer. And Lieutenant George Custer was a successful officer of the Civil War. Natives called him Yellow Hair because of his long blonde locks. And he decided to attack a Sioux and Cheyenne camp near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Little did he know, Mr. Custer only had a few hundred men, and there were over 2,000 Sioux and Cheyenne near the Little Bighorn River, when he decided to attack. A fight ensued. He decided to attack, and Custer and all of his men ended up dying. This becomes known as Custer's Last Stand. Because of this, they were just outnumbered. They got beat, but they attacked first, and they got beat pretty bad by these 2,000 Native Americans. U.S. government steps up military action after this and started to decide, you know what, we're going to take out the people who did this to our soldiers, who did this to our colonel. And you start to see people go on the run. Some of these main leaders, like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Crazy Horse eventually, at first, he surrendered, and he was thrown in jail. Some of you may have seen this Crazy Horse statue before that they're building in South Dakota, kind of like a Mount Rushmore type thing, but more in honor of a Native American rather than our white presidents. The other chief that fled was a guy named Sitting Bull. He fled to Canada. Eventually, he surrendered, and he served 2 years in prison. When he got out of prison, he went back to South Dakota and joined the reservation. But the whites that were guarding the reservation were concerned about him. Thought that they feared his influence that he would have, that they might start more kind of rebellions, revolutions against white soldiers. And pretty early on, when he moved back there was a little scuffle that happened, and he was shot and killed in that scuffle. So this did not work out well for either Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull. There's also things that happen in the Northwest and Southwest. In the Northwest, there's a tribe called the Nez Perce, whose land also was taken from them in the 1870s by the government. And they were supposed to be moved to a reservation in Idaho. And many left, but some of them decided to follow one of their chiefs, Chief Joseph, who was trying to flee to Canada once again, get out of the border of the U.S. so they can't be restrained by them. And they were resisted. They traveled over 1,000 miles with American soldiers following them. And after a 1,000-mile pursuit, they were eventually caught and surrendered. So it didn't work out too well for the Nez Perce either. We also have the Navajos and the Apache, who are Southwest tribes. The Navajos in 1863 resisted relocation after their houses and crops were burned by white soldiers. Once they were captured, they were forced to walk 300 miles, where hundreds of them died. And in the Navajo history, this is now known as the Long Walk. The Apache Indians as well. There's a chief named Geronimo who had followers that resisted relocation, and they did a little bit differently. They were a little bit more proactive, I guess you would say, in their resistance. They started to raid white settlements as a protest of them being forced to be relocated. Geronimo was actually caught several times, but managed to escape every single time. Eventually, he said, enough with it. He surrendered, and he was sent to prison. So, a lot of conflict. But with that, there was also a big change in the livelihood for Native Americans. Prior to the Civil War, there's about 60 million buffalo roaming the West. As the railroad was built, settlers and railroad workers began to hunt them. They wasted pretty much all of the buffalo. Sometimes they would take some meat for a meal or two. Other times they hunted them purely for the pelts so that they could sell their hides. And from 1870 on, about 1 million buffalo per year were killed and basically wasted. You can see here just piles of buffalo that were shot from railroad workers and settlers. Most of the times, most of the body was wasted. In 1877, Congress passed the Dawes Act. This was basically forced assimilation for Native Americans. Basically, they said, okay, if we're going to move these Native Americans to reservations, or if we're going to coexist with them, we need to start encouraging them to act more like whites, right? So we're going to give them, they thought this was going to be a great thing for the natives. We'll give them farmland. We'll divide tribal lands into plots, and we'll teach them how to become farmers. Well, most of them didn't want to be farmers. Most of them wanted to live off the land, follow the buffalo, be nomadic tribes like they were before. Most of them wanted to follow in the traditions of the other people in their tribes. So this wasn't, even though the whites thought this was a great idea, for most Native Americans, this is not something that they wanted to do. They also created boarding schools for the kids of the Native Americans, right, where they taught them how to dress like whites, talk like whites. They had them do manual labor. And because of this, they weren't treated very well. And there was rampant disease and death in these boarding houses. Right? They were teaching our men to walk, to talk, and to act like whites, is what the Native Americans believed. And they weren't whites. They had their own traditions. They had their own way of life. And they saw this as a travesty because they're seeing the traditions of their tribes disappear. Lastly, this all kind of ends with one big massacre, something called Wounded Knee. There was a guy named Wovoka the Prophet, and he gave people hope. He told his followers that he had a vision, that one day whites would lead the West, buffalo would return. And this was really a sign of hope for the Native American people. He got them to do a ghost dance in 1890. This was a critical part. It was a ritual that he thought would help to make this vision come true. When white officials saw it, they witnessed it. They saw it as war preparation and not a ritual. And they opened fire on 200 men, women, and children. that were unarmed, that couldn't fight back, that were doing a peaceful ghost dance. Originally, this was called a battle. And in newspapers and things like that, that's how it was reported on. That there was a battle at Wounded Knee between the natives and the white soldiers. But really what it was is it was a massacre. And it was the last armed conflict between the natives and the U.S. government. Huge, big conflict between these two groups of people. And Wounded Knee today is still looked at as one of the worst massacres in U.S. history. So what does all this remind you of? Right, think about relocations of an entire group of people, unprovoked killing of men, women, and children, a hatred towards a specific race or people, oftentimes hidden from our students in our textbooks, right? Oftentimes you aren't talked about about these things. You don't hear about them in true detail. What other things does this remind you of in history? Have you heard of something like this going on somewhere else around the world? That's what I want you to think about. And that's where we'll kind of pick it up in class. But think about that. Have a good day. Thanks for listening. Sorry about my voice. I've got a little cough coming on here. Have a good night, guys.